Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. Yumei and I are pleased to be here to share an overview with you of our recent study of Indiana and Minnesota students who focused on career and technical education in high school. I want to first acknowledge the larger study team pictured here. Jim Lindsay was our other principal investigator, and we were supported by two great analysts, Jingtong Pan and Max Pardo. This was really a true team effort to coordinate data from two states and to conduct parallel analyses that also took into account each state's unique CTE context. So I'll briefly introduce, we looked at 4 research questions for this study, which came out of a request initially from stakeholders in Indiana from the Commission for Higher Education, who expressed to us interest in better understanding each of these questions. So we started by examining the percentage of high school graduates in each state who were CTE concentrators, explorers, samplers, and non-participants, and I'll share a detailed definition of each of these categories momentarily. Then we examined what student and high school background characteristics were associated with high school graduates' enrollment in and completion of CTE courses in each of these categories. And then finally, we conducted 2 sets of causal analyses. First, examining the effect of taking and completing CTE courses in high school on graduates' college enrollment and graduation outcomes. And second, examining the effect of being a CTE concentrator or explorer on high school graduates' employment and earnings. We use the same data to answer all 4 research questions, but different methods depending on the question, and I'll describe each of these in turn briefly. So first, in both states, we combined data across state agencies and across multiple years. The K-12 data included student courses taken, demographic characteristics, grade 8 achievement test scores, which we used as background, and then characteristics of students' high schools. The post-secondary data included our key college outcomes, including enrollment, graduation, progress in college in terms of credits earned for Minnesota specifically. And then we also were able to use National Student Clearinghouse data to capture these outcomes for students who were not attending public colleges and universities in each of the states. And then our employment data included employment within each of the states, and then quarterly wages for those who were employed in each state. To address the first research question, we tabulated the percentage of students in each of 4 categories of CTE participation. These are the concentrators, explorers, samplers, and non-participants that I mentioned earlier. The 2 states define these categories somewhat differently, and we used each state's specific definition that was in place during the years of study. So in Indiana, concentrators were those who completed at least 6 semester credits in a single CTE pathway. Explorers completed at least 6 semester credits in CTE, but did not reach that 6 credit threshold in any specific pathway. Samplers completed fewer than 6 semester credits in CTE, and non-participants completed no credits in CTE. In Minnesota, concentrators were defined as those who completed at least 150 hours, which was about 2 semesters in a CTE career field. Explorers were those who completed at least 150 hours, but not at least 150 hours in any specific field. Samplers completed more than 1 hour, but fewer than 150 hours in CTE. And non-participants were those who received no instruction in CTE. To address the second research question, we examined the background characteristics of high school graduates. So these are student characteristics as well as characteristics of their high schools. And we cross-tabulated those characteristics with each of the 4 CTE classification groups. And then with our partners, we identified a threshold of 5 percentage points or larger as considered a meaningful difference between categories. And then to address research questions 3 and 4, we used a matching method that allowed us to make causal inferences about the effects of being a CTE concentrator rather than a sampler or a non-participant. And similarly, the effects of being a CTE explorer rather than a sampler or a non-participant. So this matching process matched concentrators with samplers and non-participants who were similar to the concentrators on many background characteristics that we were able to observe in the data, but differ just in terms of their CTE classification status. And then we did the same thing for explorers, matching to similar samplers and non-participants. And then for this research question, we looked at multiple college outcomes related to enrollment, college credits earned, and then certificate or degree completion. And then to address research question 4, we use the same match comparison groups I described previously, and use those groups to examine employment and earnings for the match groups in each of the first 5 years after high school. I'll turn it over to Yan-Mei now, and she's going to share some of our findings with you.
Thanks, Megan. Hello, everybody. This is Yan-Mei Wan, and I'm a senior researcher at AR, and I'm happy to highlight some of the key findings from the study. So research question 1 asked about what percentage of high school graduates were CTE concentrators, explorers, samplers, and non-participants. We found that Indiana and Minnesota showed different patterns of CTE participation over time. The graph on the left shows that participation in CTE among Indiana graduates increased over time. The percentage of concentrators increased from 15% in 2013-14 to 28% in the 27-18 cohort. CTE participation in Minnesota, however, remained consistent over time, as is shown in the chart on the right. Nearly half, a little less than half of students who graduate from high schools between 2013 and 2018 were concentrators, and the percentage of graduates in the other 3 categories also remained stable during this period of time. So research question 2 examines what background student and school characteristics are associated with being a CTE concentrator. We found that CTE participation is associated with school geographic locale. In both states, graduates in urban and suburban areas were less likely to concentrate in a CTE field, whereas they were more likely to be non-participants than their graduates in schools that located in towns and rural areas. We also found that in both states, there were several student characteristics that are associated with CTE participation. Male graduates were more likely to be concentrators than female graduates, and graduates who received special education services were more likely to be concentrators than graduates who didn't receive any special education services. And also graduates who were not proficient reading in grade 8, that is before they enter high school, were more likely to be concentrators than graduates who were proficient at that time. Research question 3 asks how college outcomes of CTE concentrators compared with samplers and non-participants. As Megan just mentioned, we were comparing like similar group of CTE concentrators and sampler and non-participants. So we found that so after all the student characteristics and school characteristics were adjusted for, concentrators in both states had lower overall college enrollment. However, the lower rates among concentrators were evident only for 4-year colleges, where they enrolled at a rate of 8 to 16 percentage points below that of similar samplers and non-participants. The enrollment for 2-year colleges, however, was 4 to 7 percentage points higher for concentrators than for similar samplers and non-participants. In both states, concentrators were between 5 to 12 percentage points less likely to attain a 4-year bachelor's degree than similar samplers and non-participants. And the concentrators were 1 to 2 percentage points more likely to attain an associate degree than similar samplers and non-participants. In Minnesota, we also found that concentrators were 2 percentage points more likely to attain a certificate than similar samplers and non-participants. The last research question compare like how the employment and the earnings of outcomes for these two group students. In both states, we found that concentrators were more likely than similar samplers and non-participants to be employed during the first 5 years after graduation. In Indiana, the employments during the first 5 years after high school graduation were 3 to 5 percentage points higher for concentrators than for similar samplers and non-participants. In Minnesota, the employments for concentrators in the first 5 years after high school graduation were 2 to 4 percentage points higher for concentrators. Lastly, in both states, concentrators had higher annual earnings than similar samplers and non-participants during the first 5 years after graduation. So Indiana, the differences were between $1,100 to $1,300 annually. And in Minnesota, that difference is about $1,200 to $2,400. These are all, I should say, these are all $2013. So maybe in today's dollar amount, that should be a little bit higher than that. So I will now turn it back to Megan to discuss some of the limitations of our study and implications.
Thanks, Yanmei. So the study does have a few limitations that we wanted to point out that would be helpful to keep in mind when interpreting these study findings. First, we were able to examine college credit attainment in Minnesota only. This outcome was not available in the data we received from Indiana. Second, we did limit our focus to high school graduates so that we could assign the graduates to CTE classifications based on their full high school curricula. This may mask other effects of being a CTE concentrator if high school graduation rates differ based on CTE classification status. Third, our matching approach relied on identifying students who had similar observable characteristics, that is the characteristics that were available in the data we received. The matched students could differ in other unobserved ways that also could have implications for masking some findings. Also, we were not able to match all concentrators and explorers to a similar sampler or non-participant because we were really looking for those students who were similar on other observable characteristics. So our match rate was fairly high in Indiana, 91% we were able to match. In Minnesota, it was a little bit lower. So the findings may not generalize to all high school graduates. And then finally, our findings about the effects of being a CTE concentrator are limited to the first 5 years after high school graduation. And it may be the case that these findings might change if we were able to look at longer term trajectories. For example, some of the earnings differences may start to disappear or reverse over a longer time period. And then we did identify several implications for our state partners, and we'll have the opportunity shortly to hear more about these and some additional takeaways from one of our partners. First, educators may want to explore why certain graduate and high school characteristics were associated with larger or smaller percentages of CTE concentrators to identify potential sources of inequitable participation. Second, high school teachers and guidance counselors could use these findings to help inform students who are considering their course taking options. And then third, we hope future research will expand on these findings in a couple of ways. First, to examine how the findings might vary for students who concentrated in different fields. And I did see Natalia had a question in the chat box about that. We were not able to disaggregate by field of study within the scope of this research report, but it's definitely an area of interest for us and for our partners in the future. And then also to examine in future research whether these findings remain consistent or change as graduates move beyond that 5-year mark after high school graduation. So I'll pause here to open it up to any questions about the study and these findings.
Thanks, Megan. I think in the interest of time, we're just going to move to Troy's slides, and then we'll come back to questions afterwards. But thank you so much for the presentation.
Great, thank you. And then just briefly, I wanted to mention, if you're interested in engaging further, you can read the full report and appendices, as well as some shorter summaries, including a 4-page brief, a 1-page snapshot, and an infographic at the link shown here. And then, of course, you're also welcome to reach out directly to Ian May or myself with any follow-up questions. We always love to hear from folks. For now, though, we're pleased to have one of our state partners here to share his thoughts. So I'll turn it over to Troy now.